Beneath the silence of forgotten towns, there are stories that were never meant to be told. Stories that twist the very fabric of family, of loyalty, of blood. Tonight we walk into one of those shadows, a tale that carries the weight of shame, horror, and inevitability. Imagine a bride walking down the aisle, her face pale but calm, her eyes hollow with secrets. The whispers behind her gown are not about love, not about hope. They are about bloodlines collapsing in on themselves. Because the man waiting at the altar was not only her husband, he was her brother, and inside her womb grew a child born of both. This is not a rumor, this is not folklore. This is the buried history of an American bride whose story was nearly erased because of how deeply it unsettled the world around her. But the records exist, the testimonies, the court whispers, the traces in census archives. They paint the portrait of a family so entangled in its own blood that it ceased to resemble anything human. When outsiders discovered the truth, they did not speak it openly. They locked it away, as if saying the words aloud would spread the infection further. To understand her story, you must step into a world where isolation was not only a choice, but a destiny. Families who lived far from towns, who trusted no one but themselves, who repeated the same surnames generation after generation until they lost track of who was brother, who was uncle, who was father. This bride was born into such a family where boundaries dissolved, where necessity blurred into ritual, and where love became something far darker. The horror of her life cannot be measured only in the act itself, but in what it represented. She became a symbol of what happens when secrecy devours morality, when the human instinct for survival bends inward and begins consuming its own bloodline. Her marriage was not simply a scandalous, it was the echo of generations before her who had done the same in silence. Tonight, I will take you into her world, into the rooms where walls kept out the law but could not keep in the truth. Into the fields where her family worked the soil, as if burying their shame with every harvest. Into the church where she stood dressed in white, while those who dared to watch pretended they did not know who the man beside her really was. This is her story, a story you were never meant to hear. Her childhood was a cage disguised as a home. In the hills where her family lived, there were no neighbors close enough to see what went on behind their doors. No school teachers asking questions, no doctors keeping records. The family was their own world, and in that world, blood was the only bond that mattered. She was born into a lineage already heavy with the weight of incest. Grandparents had married cousins, uncles had taken nieces, and her parents themselves were more closely related than they admitted aloud. From her earliest years, she was taught that the family must stay within itself, that outsiders brought ruin, disease, and betrayal. There are fragments of testimony, whispers that made their way into local gossip, that suggest she never knew where the line between sibling and spouse truly stood. Her older brother was the one who guided her when their parents were gone, the one who gave her food, the one who protected her in a household that felt more like a prison. By the time she was a teenager, that protection had shifted into something else, something unspoken, something that grew in the silence of isolation. To her, he was not just a brother. He became everything. For those on the outside, it is impossible to imagine how such a boundary could collapse. But in families consumed by generations of inbreeding, the walls of morality are thinner. What is forbidden elsewhere becomes natural inside their world. And when survival means clinging to the only people who will not cast you out, loyalty turns into possession. She did not resist him. Perhaps she did not know how. Perhaps she believed this was what love was meant to look like. By the time she was old enough to marry, there were no options beyond him. No suitors dared approach a family known for its strange ways, for its tight grip on its daughters. And so the brother who had been her keeper became our groom. When the bans were whispered in church, the congregation lowered their eyes. They pretended not to notice. To acknowledge the truth would have meant acknowledging a sickness that had been festering in their community for decades. The girl walked toward him as if walking toward destiny, not choice. Her white dress covered the secret already growing inside her. She was carrying his child, even before the vows had been spoken. And with that child, the bloodline tightened its grip. The pregnancy was not whispered about. It was hidden. Behind closed doors, the family moved in unison, guarding her as though her body carried not just a child but a legacy. In their eyes, she was not simply a bride, not simply a sister. She was a vessel meant to continue the bloodline without interference from the outside world. They fed her, watched over her, silenced her when her body ached under the strain. There were no doctors, no midwives, no voices of reason to intervene. Only family, always family, watching as her body became the stage for their darkest tradition. But nature has its own laws, and it does not forgive the sins of repetition. Inbreeding leaves scars not only in the mind, but in the flesh. The child she carried was already burdened with generations of collapse. Each birth in such a family carries the weight of chance. Will the baby emerge whole or broken by the tangled strands of blood that should never have crossed? This was the silent fear that hung over her house. Every cough, every fever, every whisper of weakness in the child's kicks stirred dread that they had finally gone too far. When the baby was born, the truth was undeniable. Accounts suggest the child struggled from the very first breath, frail, weak, caught between life and death before life had even begun. Some say the infant's features bore the unmistakable marks of genetic ruin, though such things were rarely recorded. Neighbors noticed only that the baby was never shown in public, hidden away just as the mother had been during her pregnancy. Whether the child lived weeks or months, whether it grew at all, remains uncertain. The family guarded that secret fiercely, as though exposing the child would expose them all. And through it all, she remained silent. The bride, the sister, the mother. Did she feel shame, or was she so consumed by the world she was raised in that she could not even name what had been done to her? We cannot know. What we do know is that she stayed bound by blood and duty as her family's cycle of secrecy repeated itself yet again. She was not the first to carry her brother's child, and she would not be the last. The community around them was not blind. In small towns and rural corners of America, secrets travel quietly, but they travel nonetheless. Neighbors may not have spoken openly, yet they exchanged glances when the family appeared together in church, when the children seemed too close in age and too alike in appearance, when whispers of deformities or sudden deaths reached their ears. People saw, but they did not intervene. To acknowledge it was to invite a horror they could not bear to face, easier to avert the eyes, easier to call it gossip, easier to let the family rot in silence rather than confront what was festering in plain sight. There is a cruelty in silence. For the bride, it meant she lived not only with her family's control, but with the knowledge that outsiders would never save her. The church preached morality, yet its doors opened to a union of blood siblings without protest. The law existed, but in places so remote, it was nothing more than words on paper. When people did speak, their voices carried only as far as the tavern corners or the porches of neighbors who already knew the truth. Shame had a way of suffocating justice. Some records suggest that whispers reached authorities, but in that time, cases of incest were handled like diseases to be quarantined, not crimes to be prosecuted. Authorities may have visited, but they left with nothing. Perhaps they took pity on the bride, seeing her not as a victim, but as complicit. Perhaps they feared the scandal it would bring, not only on the family, but on the community itself. After all, if one family could fall this far, what did it say about those who allowed it to continue unchecked? And so the silence deepened. The family thrived in its secrecy, harvesting its crops, keeping its doors shut tight, allowing no outsiders to cross its threshold. And the bride, still young, still bound, lived on as though she had stepped into a role scripted for her long before she was born. She had become the proof of what her family always believed, that they could fold in on themselves endlessly, generation after generation, and no one would ever stop them. Every community has its buried shame. In this one, it wore a white dress, carried a child, and walked hand in hand with her brother. What makes her story most haunting is not only what happened to her, but what it reveals about the human mind when it is cut off from the wider world. Isolation does not just build fences, it reshapes morality. When you grow up being told that outsiders are dangerous, when you are warned never to trust beyond your bloodline, when every voice you hear is your own family echoing the same words, the forbidden begins to feel natural. For her, love was not something discovered, it was something dictated, assigned, enforced by the walls of her home. Psychologists today describe this as a collapse of social boundaries. In closed groups, especially those marked by secrecy and suspicion, the lines between roles blur. A brother becomes a father becomes a husband. Daughters become mothers of their own cousins or sisters or even their father's child. Over time, the language of family itself breaks down until the very words lose their meaning. In her case, brother and husband were not opposites. They were one and the same. But there is another layer, one that chills deeper. Complicity. She was not dragged to the altar kicking and screaming. She walked, dressed in white, holding flowers, her eyes forward. Some would say she had a choice. But did she? If you are raised in a prison without bars, taught that there is no life beyond the one you were given, how can you even imagine rebellion? Her silence was not consent. It was survival. It was the only language she had left. And that silence became her legacy. The child she bore, whether frail, hidden, or lost, was proof that the cycle was working exactly as intended. Families like hers thrived not because they were unseen, but because they were unchallenged. Each generation sacrificed one of its daughters to the same fate, and each daughter believed she was fulfilling her duty. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you run? Would you resist? Or would you, like her, lower your head and carry the weight of silence? As time passed, her story dissolved into shadows. The church records list a marriage but omit the scandal. Census documents list children but do not name the true father. Official history erased the sin in ink, yet the community never forgot. Families that lived nearby carried the whispers through generations, mothers warning their daughters to stay away from that family, men making jokes in hushed voices about blood that was too thick. She became both a warning and a ghost, a figure who existed between rumor and fact. But the most disturbing truth is that she was not unique. Her story is only one strand in a web that stretches across America's forgotten corners. Isolated valleys, deep Appalachian hollows, abandoned mining towns, places where poverty, distance, and secrecy gave birth to families who folded in on themselves. Many never saw the light of exposure, but some did, and their stories mirror hers with chilling precision. A sister becomes a wife, a brother becomes a father, a child becomes something caught between categories, both loved and hidden, both celebrated and shamed. In the years after her death, the family continued. More children were born, some strong, some sickly, some who never reached adulthood. Every birth carried the same question: how much further could the bloodline bend before it snapped entirely? Yet they kept going. Not because they were blind to the consequences, but because secrecy had already consumed them. To stop would mean facing what they had done. And so they pressed forward, generation after generation, burying their shame deeper with every new grave they dug. What remains of her is not photographs or journals, but fragments, names in brittle documents, stories passed like poison through the mouths of neighbors, and the undeniable fact that her bloodline endured, twisted though it was. Somewhere, even now, her descendants may walk among us, carrying in their veins the echo of her brother's child. They may not even know the truth of where they came from, for secrets like this have a way of rewriting themselves into silence. And so her memory lingers like a shadow in the archive of America's forgotten sins. She was a bride, a sister, a mother, and a prisoner of a legacy she could never escape. There is a final terrible lesson buried in her story. When we speak of inbreeding, of incest, of families collapsing inward, we often think of it as a grotesque curiosity, a piece of folklore whispered for shock. But for her, it was not folklore. It was life. It was the only reality she ever knew, and in that reality her body became both a battlefield and a tomb, where innocence was buried, where choice was suffocated, where the future was written in blood long before she was even born. She was not evil, she was not a monster, she was a victim of a system built long before her birth, a system of secrecy and silence, where each generation passed its curse on to the next. The wedding gown she wore was not a symbol of love, it was a shroud. The child she carried was not a miracle, it was evidence of a cycle that no one dared to break, and her silence was not agreement, it was the only shield she had against a world that would not save her. When we look back at her life, what we see is not just one family's ruin, we see a reflection of something deeper, something that still lives in the darker corners of human nature, the urge to hide shame instead of confronting it, the willingness of communities to turn away rather than intervene, the way silence itself can become the most dangerous accomplice of all. Her story warns us that horror does not always live in haunted houses or in tales of ghosts. Sometimes it lives in the very homes we pass every day, in the families who lock their doors, in the brides who walk down aisles carrying secrets too heavy for their frail bodies to bear. She carried her brother's child. She wore the title of wife when she should have only been a sister. And though her name may never be spoken aloud, the echo of her life lingers like a wound that never healed. And so we end where we began, with a bride walking toward her groom, not in joy, not in fear, freedom, but in silence. A silence that swallowed her whole, and a silence that still whispers to us from the forgotten edges of history.